Good morning. Where I live here in Cornwall, it's right in the middle of the old copper and tin mining area. So, I mean, literally, my house is just 100 yards from here. So I've got this kind of thing behind me, these kind of structures, which are, well, these are actually called stamps, which is where the ore was taken from the mines further up and was brought here to be crushed prior to being processed in other ways. And but there are mines all around here. You know, the landscape is dotted with them. I'll just pan around so you can see that. So you can probably see the mines on the horizon. There's some more up there. And there's loads more across the other side of the road. It's a fascinating place. I love living around here. Of course, none of these mines are working. They're all closed down and kind of preserved. Where I'm standing right now, actually, I'm standing on a grid, but under the grid is a hole. I'm looking down into a mine there. I don't know how deep, it's quite deep. I can hear water running at the bottom. There's some more, as you can see. So this is all disused. If I'd been here 100 years ago, this would have been a very different kind of place, and the cottage where I'm living, which is an old miner's cottage, would have been a different kind of habitation. And this, you know, there would have been hundreds of people working in this environment. Carts going up and down this lane in front of me here, taking the ore from the top down here to the stamps. And underneath the ground where I'm walking, there would have been, you know, men crawling backwards and forwards, whacking at the seam with these pickaxes, you know, doing all that kind of stuff. And it's funny to walk amongst this environment, because I can't help be reminded of that. And it's almost like I'm walking amongst the ghosts of that environment when I'm walking around here. They're on top of this landscape, or buried within this landscape, which now is kind of rural and slightly heritage-ified, you know. But supervenient upon it is this other landscape, which is an industrial landscape. I mean, we don't think of Cornwall as an industrial area these days, but certainly this area where I am was absolutely an industrial area, and probably not a very nice place to work. They used a lot of arsenic in the mining industry, for example. So there were lots of toxic fumes. There was lots of. It was a horrible job, you know. It's a dirty, horrible job. And that world, both the physical world of seams that are being mined underneath me, so pathways of seams underneath me, and the physical environment on the surface, that world, but also the social world of miners working in these places, men and women. Not, well, the women didn't go down the mines, but the women did work in some of the places here. And the social environment of the town there, the little village where I live, is still redolent in this environment, really. And it's fascinating living on. I think we all live in more than one world, don't we? We all live in more than one town or city or village at the same time. It's overlaid with other kinds of spaces. Yeah, of course, there's a relatively rigid architecture to these spaces. They don't change overnight. Although I was in London last weekend, and out the hotel window there was just a mass of cranes on the horizon. So clearly things are changing. Even in the most permanent of architectures, things change. And after the rain down here a couple of weeks ago, one of the beaches that I go to has completely changed its configuration. But generally the landscape tends to stay the same. But over and above that, the other kinds of, there's always other landscapes on top of it, isn't there? The social maps that form these places, the historical maps that people are still affected by, and some people are still living in. The kind of maps of power relationships that operate in these environments are still alive. So it's almost as if these are layers. And we've all got our own maps too, haven't we? You know, the way I walk through these places and the way I see them and the kind of things that my attention is drawn to, the kinds of landscapes that I find myself walking down, and what feels natural to me, the natural kind of psychogeography of my wander forms a personal map for myself that might be different to yours. And some of these are quite imaginative as well. I'm just pointing to this bit of, I'm not quite sure what went on down there, but it looks quite interesting. Or I'm not quite sure what went on in this building either. But again, quite interesting. And look at that, it's like an old fortress. But what I'm interested in here is the fact that we don't live in a single city, or we don't live on a single town, or within a single landscape. We all live within multiple landscapes, and a lot of these are kind of landscapes and cities of the imagination. You know, they don't, and by that I don't mean they're fictional, although they could easily be. It's more that they're constructed through imaginal processes of making connections which are really cognitive or personally psychological or social. They're not part of the fabric of the landscape necessarily. They exist within our understanding of it and our interpretation of it. You know, the connection between the building that I'm standing in right now and those little cottages down there isn't just about the fact that we occupy the same few hundred square metres of land. It's also that people would walk up here, and there's paths carved into the ground from people walking up here and walking back every day to come to work. So all these imaginary cities, imaginary towns, imaginary places are kind of palimpsests of one another. You know the palimpsest, a piece of writing that's done on top of an old erased piece of writing, but the old erasure never quite goes away. And what I'm thinking of here, I'm imagining one thing, I'm remembering one thing, and I'm thinking about something else. The first thing I'm remembering is one of my favourite short books by a writer called Italo Calvino, and it's called Invisible Cities. It's a beautiful short book. I can't remember when he wrote it, but it tells the story of Marco Polo, the explorer Marco Polo, and he's talking to Kublai Khan, and he's talking about his travels, and Kublai Khan wants him to tell him what the world's like. So he describes these different cities that he's been in, and they've all got what appear to be women's names, the cities that he describes, and they're loosely grouped into categories: cities and eyes, thin cities, different kind of categories. And these cities that Marco Polo describes are all highly kind of, well, he's sometimes called a magical realist writer. So the cities that he's describing are kind of highly improbable and beautifully described. So there's a city which just consists of plumbing, for example, and if you visit this city, there are just pipes and bathtubs hung in the air. There are other cities. There's a city which rebuilds itself every night. Every day people live in the city, and then they move out of the city and move to the next one next door. So the world is slowly filling up with these cities that are constantly trying to be new. There's a city which is perfectly reflected under the ground, and the inhabitants live both above the ground and below the ground. And you get a sense with these cities that Calvino is describing in the voice of Marco Polo, that these are all kind of, yes, they're fictional, yes, they're imaginary and kind of magical, but they're also saying something about what experiences in cities is like. And what kind of transpires in that particular book is that the city that he's describing is all the same city. It's all Venice. Marco Polo is just describing Venice in all the myriad ways in which it can be described, and with the suggestion that there could be myriad more ways of describing it, and just mapping the architecture and pointing to the grid references of it on a map doesn't capture the human habitation of a city. You have to kind of use the imagination to get to that. And so I'm thinking of YouTube in that light. YouTube as this city What kind of a city is YouTube? If we were to use Italo Calvino's methodology, if I can call it that, of reimagining a city not just as bricks and mortar and streets and shops, but as human habitation rendered through human imagination. One of the things that springs to my mind right now is cities of glass. One of the things that I often think about with YouTube is how transparent we appear to be to one another. I say appear to be, but we reveal, don't we, in these videos. We peer at one another through the glass of the lens of the camera, through the glass of the monitor screen, and catch glimpses of one another in reflections and shards of light bounced off one another's faces. So in some ways, for me, it's a kind of city of glass, a transparent city. I'm reminded of a book by David Brin, who used to write for Wired magazine, who talked about the transparent society. The transparent society. He was talking about surveillance culture at the time, and how our understanding of surveillance has changed over the last 10 years, certainly. It used to be that the key model for surveillance, in which there's a camera in every street corner, a camera in every office and every shop and every government building, which of course there are. He says the old model for that is the panopticon, in which all these cameras are sent to a central point, and the forces of control and power monitor these cameras day in, day out. It's the 1984 model of surveillance, where the police and the security forces and the government always know what you're doing. So the society is kind of transparent, but it's transparent to the forces of power. And David Brin says we have a new kind of transparency, born of a new kind of use of surveillance, he says. And this is an example of it right now, where there's just as many cameras as before. In fact, there are more cameras. Not only are there cameras in street corners and in shops and government buildings, but there's also cameras in people's homes, and there's cameras in people's hands, and there are cameras wherever people go, and people are putting themselves under surveillance. It's not for the forces of control. It's like a different kind of society, a society which surveils itself. And the outputs for those cameras don't go to a central point. They don't go to this, what's called the panopticon, the central point where government or the security forces or the warders of this particular prison planet can watch you. The cameras don't lead there. The cameras lead to the public domain. The output from the cameras go onto YouTube or somewhere else like it. So this isn't a society which is transparent to power, it's a society which is transparent to itself. We're all surveilling one another, and the walls that we put up, like these walls, have kind of crumbled and been replaced by walls of glass. It's a transparent society, David Brin would say. I'm thinking about walls of glass, just one last reference to that. There's a book I was working with last semester with some first year students, which is a book from the 1920s by a Russian author called, the author was called Yevgeny Zamyatin, and the book was called We. And it's about a kind of dystopian future society in which everyone is reduced to being a number. It's that kind of classic totalitarian. It's a book which set the tone for George Orwell's 1984 and Brave New World. But in that society, the city itself is made of glass, so everyone can see everyone else, and everyone watches everyone else to make sure everyone else is towing the party line and being a good citizen of that society. If this is a city of glass, if that's my imagination of this city I'm in right now, a city of glass, albeit one which is overlaid onto a city or a landscape that has 150-year-old copper workings on its surface and beneath my feet, and overlaid again onto my current occupation of this as a university lecturer living in what used to be a cottage over there, what used to be a miner's cottage. If this city of glass is overlaid onto that one, then there's other cities clearly in operation here, isn't there? Some of them located in space, in physical space, some of them located in social spaces, some of them located purely in the space of imagination. So that's my city right now, Mine's a city of glass in which we're looking at one another through glass. And sometimes those views we see of one another are distorted and twisted and broken, and sometimes they're clear. Anyway, do you have an idea for imaginary city?